Hey guys, what's up? My name is Carter. Welcome to Fix Your Shitty Movement. We are talking about a very commonly heard, used cue in particularly the squat, and that is knees open. Is that a bad cue? I don't think so. I use it, but when I use it, it's with the understanding with like my clients or whatever that they know what I'm talking about when I say that, and it's a much easier way to say what I'm about to break down for you than 10 different words in one sentence while someone is trying to grind out a squat. That's really where I find it to be the most useful. Also in like a sumo deadlift is if someone's like fighting for it, it's like knees open, right? Because what happens, right, is your knees will collapse in when you're fighting for it, right? And there's a lot of misunderstanding about what muscles you're using when you do that, how to mitigate it, and what you can do so that it doesn't have to be a thing that someone says to you, that you can just like practice it. And where do I even begin, right? That's where that's what I always say, right? Like, God, I have so much shit to talk. Where do I even start? So, knees open. If you have ever seen someone fighting their way out of a squat, even like a front squat, in fact, I think front squat, it tends to be a little more common to this. When they're coming down, right, their knees collapse in. So, I'm gonna get back to that. Their knees collapse in, right? And people interpret that as glute weakness, which I think there is some element of that going on for sure, but this is gonna be a huge shock to you guys. The main thing that's weak are your feet. Your feet and also just your form, right? Which is, I mean, kind of the same thing, right? When I talk about something being weak, I actually mean weak in a way that you don't know how to communicate with it and you don't know how to tell it what to do. If you're lifting weights and shit, especially if you're powerlifting or something, then you're not weak. Like, I mean, I think that's kind of a no-brainer, right? What's weak is either the order that something is firing or even your awareness of something firing. And I don't even like using the word firing because I think it has there's a lot of ways to misinterpret that. But the only reason my hips move at all, right, is mainly because of my feet moving. The other thing is is pelvic lumbar stability, right? So bracing and core strength also has a lot to do with that. But bracing and core strength is along the same lines. People don't know how to hold their pelvis, especially, and their spine in the correct position and maintain it throughout the squat in order to have a more successful hip position, right? Because I mean, that's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about your hips. So even if I do though, right, even if I keep all of this just like locked in tight, if my feet move, my hips are gonna move, right? Like I can hold all that in tight, but if my feet are moving, then so that entire chain is going to move because that's what's connecting me to the ground, right? So that's really why I'm going to keep the focus right there. So instead of knees open, what can you say? Well, a lot of things. Kabuki uses I talk about Kabuki all the time. I fucking love those guys. They talk a lot about like the feet, ankle stability, and as that being the focus to fix the knees open cue. But I take a different approach, and it's from Pilates. So if you have watched my low bar squat videos or my most recent bench press video, I talked about the hand and your grip and how the grip is actually what you want to focus on is going from the pinky knuckle to like the thumb, like the heel of the hand, not so much, but like the actual thumb joint. And that you're getting this like cross action, and that's what's going to help you keep your hand in a position that will not only help you anchor the bar to you better, but will make your wrists and elbows feel a lot better. It's the same with the feet. I know, what a shocking thing to say. But if you just even, see I wore red pants, not on purpose. I need to do laundry. No, I did my laundry, I got a laundry service. But anyway, but this actually helps because you'll be able to see fairly clearly here. So I'm standing with my feet parallel, and I have a pretty high arch. It's not as high as it used to be, but it looks like my knees are, pretty much pointed forward. So if I press my feet down, first of all, you can see right there, maybe, it's pretty subtle, that my hips kind of shifted down this way. At least that's what it felt like. And it's oh so slightly visible just by standing taller, right? A lot of that is also pulling myself off my fucking pelvis, so I'm not resting my entire torso on there, just like hanging out there all the time. But the other thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna press the ball of my foot down. And then I'm going to think about trying to corkscrew the pinky side of my foot outward while simultaneously pulling the inside of the heel inward. So I'm literally trying to like corkscrew the ground. And do you see what happened to my knees, right? Do you see what happened to my alignment, right? My shins even moved in a much more favorable position, right? Pretty weird, right? Why is that important? Well, you should be focusing on your feet anyway, because that's what's launching you off of the ground in squat, deadlift, whatever, in your day-to-day fucking life. Although I don't stand around and think about my feet all day. But again, when you strengthen them, you're strengthening that awareness so that you don't really have to, that it's just kind of done for you. If you have piriformis issues, groin issues, TFL issues, TFL is the muscle right here, that's an abductor that the IT band becomes, is that connective tissue that is from the TFL basically. Piriformis is a muscle deep in your hip that's an external rotator, right? And the thing that's unique about the piriformis, if you know, you know, is that it's so deep in the hip that it's literally a part of that pelvic diaphragm, like your pelvic floor. And so that's why it is so intricately related to core, bracing, and all that shit. But again, we're just gonna focus on the lower half. It's an external rotator. So you can see too, if you're like cranking your knees open, right? Like some people do with the bands, and I'm gonna get to that in a second. They push their knees open, right? And you see my feet aren't actually like stable when I do that, right? When they're doing that. And some people will do it like this, right? Like they'll force into external rotation. Your glutes do abduct and your glutes do externally rotate. But a lot of times what happens is when you're cranking on your hip to move in one direction or another, or your knee for that matter, because it's the same fucking thing, that is what causes a lot of those problems, because your glutes are humongous, right? Like, I mean, depending, right, if you're lucky. Gluteus maximus, right, is huge, and then your gluteus medius, which is direct neighbors with piriformis, another reason why it's such an important player in mitigating hip pain especially. And then glute minimus, which we're not going to talk about, but TFL, those are very small muscles in relation to your gluteus maximus. And it all comes back to that hip hinge too, right? The main thing is explosive hip extension. So when you do those things in isolation, right, like crank your knees out and stuff, that's where a lot of those problems come from. So taking you down to your foundation, thinking about pressing through the ball of the big toe and trying to corkscrew your feet outward. See also what that did to the front of my hip. I hope you can see. I don't know, I always lose touch with like what is something I've just like learned to look at and what you can actually see, but people always pulling their shirts up and shit, like, hey, did you see that? I'm like, actually, looking at your clothes tells me a lot more, because I can see the way that your clothes lie. Anyway, but you can kind of see, right, when I do that too, it like opens my hips up. Like it literally creates space for me to move in a squat, right? Like I got big thighs and I don't have big hips. So these guys can really get in the way. And so having a wider stance helps me, having my toes turned out helps me. But if I go too far, then again, I'm just running into that same problem, just cranking my hips open. If I find the right spot though, I can spiral my thighs out and literally create more space, right? I'll show you from the side too. Look how that pulled my abs in and pointed my tailbone down, right? It's all plays in the same thing, right? Hip pain, knee pain, lower back pain, all that shit. It's all the same thing, and it all has the same root. Usually your feet or bracing. Bracing being the big daddy of them. But anyway, so if you have trouble with sumo or, well, we'll stick with sumo walks, I'm not surprised because people have the same fucking logic when they're doing these banded exercises because they're like, oh, you know, I have valgus collapse when I squat. That means that my gluteus medius is weak, so I need to fucking crank that motherfucker on. But most people, I used to be big like, you know, get the heavier band, the better. Absolutely not true anymore because most people's glute med is so weak and their feet are so weak that those big bands, the one that I just threw to the side, which I probably need to get in a second, it's too heavy for most people, and especially for a lot of reps. So when you're doing the sumo walks especially, if it's above your knees, you have to ask yourself, are you doing this, right? Are your feet out wider than your hips, right? Because is that not the same exact problem? And then if your step is too wide, then you're doing also, like you're just inviting that like TFL kind of shit to go on. Other thing that people do is that they don't maintain core stability. They dump into their lower back. But the main thing they do, and especially when you move the band further away from your hip, it's gonna make the exercise more difficult, right? They can't control their feet caving in, and with it their knees. And it'll be more clear to see on the knees. So they'll step and they'll step in. Or they'll start doing like this kind of shit, right? Or this kind of shit. Like ask yourself, are you doing that kind of stuff? And do you have hip pain, knee pain, lower back pain, blah, 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 when you squat, deadlift, and do all this shit, right? This is not just a warm up for your glute med, it's a warm up for your goddamn brain. Can you do this without being a fucking disaster? Because if you can't, to me that means we got something to work on besides your glute med, right? It's a starting point. It's a lot of like attention to detail. I don't expect anyone to come in and learn that and be like awesome at it at the first time, you know, but that's kind of the point. Do you have the willingness to learn how to take care of all those little details? Because it is gonna matter when you have a 1 rep max on your back, and I'm saying knees open, and you just go, right? Because when you do that, you also tend to stick your ass out and put all of your weight and the weight of the bar right into the side of the hip, right? That's piriformis town, right? I've had piriformis issues since I was in high school. I've been very aware of it through my own research because everyone was just like, oh, your shoes are too tight, because my feet would literally fall asleep when I was running. So if you have things like sensation in your feet, it's not just here, because it goes over the sciatic nerve. That's the important thing to remember with the piriformis. It literally, the sciatic nerve literally runs right next to it, in some cases right on it, which I believe is the case with me, which is why it's historically always been pissed off. So it can be referred pain. People will often feel groin pain. I feel that too. Adductor, hamstring, and I have scar tissue in those areas, so I believe that's why at this point it will refer there, but also in the side of the knee and also the bottom of the foot. So if you have issues like plantar fasciitis or IT band stuff, it might not be plantar fasciitis and IT band. I know, man, I'm just like fucking rubbing my poor nerve on a lacrosse ball and it's just not letting up. Yeah, because you're fucking smooshing your nerve. So just remember, it's never that simple, right? It can't be like, well, 2 + 2 is 4. This is what this is. Because if you continuously do something and it's not getting better, there's a bigger problem. And usually the problem, even if it is plantar fasciitis, is all about what you're doing with your hips. Are you giving yourself the space to move between your legs? Or are you literally crowding your hips and then interpreting it as impingement, right? So think about it. And think about it starting from the sumo walks and even the glute bridges. When you're doing your glute bridges and you're laying on your back, are your toes out like this? Are you out like this in your knees? Bring it in, toes forward, and learn to corkscrew and abduct from the hip. My name is Karis.